Be yourself, be positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast, the show that inspires you to change and live a more exciting life. My name is Ismail, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or topic that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life, individually and collectively. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. Today, first and foremost, we share a lot of laughter and joy with you. It was real fun and insightful talking to Payam, and I'm really excited to share this episode today with you. Payam is a psychedelic, somatic, internal family systems practitioner who interfaces with various traditional and non-traditional psychedelic compounds in the treatment of trauma and chronic pain. His work factors in the biopsychosocial and spiritual elements of healing. By acknowledging and addressing the totality of the human experience, he has seen firsthand how it can have a dramatic effect on mitigating the patient's affective experience of pain. In this episode, you will learn about internal family systems and sacred medicines. We talk about the expectations that the current society creates for all of us and how they necessarily create trauma. You will get a clear understanding of intergenerational and intercultural trauma, and you will learn which quick fix solutions definitely do not work. We talk about external validation, workshop hoppers, and what you must be aware of before embarking on the journey of healing. Payam shares with us which sacred medicines he is using in order to help seekers and why he chooses to use these specific ones. We discuss ego, systematic issues, and why we do not always need to be strong. It takes a lot of courage and acceptance to deal with your own trauma, and listening to this episode can be a first step. Always be aware that there are friends along the journey. Enjoy. And with that, Payam, a warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And my first question for you today is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
I'm happy to see you face to face. That's all I'm thinking. With the name that I read, I was like, oh, he's from my region. But then there was a van afterwards. I was like, that's a confused name.
Wonderful. So if you say from my region, where is your region, or where are you calling in from today?
Currently, I'm in New York City. Yeah, I'm in New York and bouncing all over the world, but I'm grounded here for another 3 weeks or so.
Okay, so you're dialing in from New York City today, Payam. Wonderful. And for those of the listeners who do not know you, who not have heard of you yet, what is a proper description or introduction to yourself, but also to what do you do on a daily basis, if there is such a...
Well, that's a very tricky question. What I do, I call myself a psychedelic somatic internal systems family practitioner, an IFS practitioner. I merge or I bridge the gap between shamanic practices using plant medicines, some other medicines, and synthetic medicines, and bridging that with the therapeutic models of internal family systems, somatic experiencing, sensory motor psychotherapy, and some other modalities that seem to be very, very effective in bridging the gap between medicine work and therapeutic work.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And maybe also for our audience as a context, I in fact was listening to another podcast episode where you were a guest as well, and I really enjoyed listening to the conversation of yourself and Tammy, where you talked about IFS, internal family systems, where you talked about different modalities, let's just call it, and I'm sure we're gonna give a few more details during our conversation. So once more, Payam, welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast, and I'm very excited that we can today, have an open conversation and talk about trauma, supposedly talk about different types of healing, and also talk about psychedelics and other ancient models of.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to start by acknowledging my teachers and the wisdom keepers who have taught me. So I wanted to do that, and also acknowledging the spirit of Otak and Quetzalcoatl that are my spirit teachers, and most importantly, the people that are in my care or come to me. They're my primary teachers. It takes a lot of courage to get to a place to want to do some deep healing. And I've learned so much from every single one of them. So I want to acknowledge every person that I've crossed paths with. It's been a great honor and privilege to work with them, and a privilege and honor to be with you as well. So I wanted to do that. I think it's important to first mention this invocation that we discussed. I think that the most courageous people that I work with are the ones that are warriors of the heart. They've lowered their shield, been open to meeting themselves on a level of heart, and invite that or invoke that between us together, as well as the audience. Let's be together in a space of open-heartedness and vulnerability, so that we can meet each other as well as we can meet ourselves. So I wanted to recognize that and make that invocation first. And in doing that, I also wanted to recognize that we are two men speaking, and speaking from our unique experiences, our own unique history, but also our shared history as two male beings on this planet. And I want to acknowledge also the woman that I work with. And while my paradigm is obviously informed by being a man, being a neutral gendered person, which is very difficult. I can't ever imagine being a woman because I've never been one, but to also recognize the wisdom of women who I've worked with and the wisdom of the women who have taught me. And also recognizing that there are a lot of women who may be listening to you, this podcast. So I want to acknowledge that, and acknowledge the fact that I am speaking through the lens and the experience of a man, but I also want to try to speak to the shared experiences, the common experiences that we all have that contribute to our humanity, and how we can recognize that and also address those things so that no one's left out.
So thank you very much, Payam, for that acknowledgement, and also for that introduction to the two of us and also to all of our listeners. And I can do my part in confirming that and welcoming everybody listening to this conversation that we're gonna have. And also in our pre-talk, we had actually quite an extensive pre-talk. We talked about a whole lot of topics. We talked about this shared experience, and we also talked about expectations of society on men, but also on women. And maybe we can see what we had in mind talking about this shared experience and the expectations that the society is putting on each and every one of us.
Yeah, well, I wanted to acknowledge the work of Gabor Mate, who is one of my teachers, who I've been informed by quite a bit. And he recently released a book called The Myth of Normal, and how normal in society is actually a manifestation of trauma, and normal is actually in truth insanity and disorder and mental sickness and physical sickness and societal sickness. It's influenced by capitalism and by acquiring, keeping on to this idea of only through acquisition can we then be enough. Only through acquisition can we only be happy. So we become human doings. We lose our human beings. We become less of a human being and do in order to acquire this intangible happiness that is effervescent. It can't be grabbed onto. Yes, I can buy a new car, but its luster will be lost, and our dopamine levels drop after a little while. So the work that I do, it really ultimately culminates in finding equanimity of our parts, equanimity of our history, equanimity of relationship to self, to the outside world, and in part the outside world to us. And our harmony or our balance has been thrown off by and large as a function of how the society operates, how the society had operated, and thus influenced our parents, our grandparents, and their forefathers, and how trauma could be passed on unknowingly without that awareness, and how that impacts people in distorting their view of themselves and how they feel like they need to operate in this world, and how that distortion actually causes a lot of disease of mind and body.
And before we lay deeper a little bit those structures that seem to be pain infecting, we talked about harmony, and we talked a little bit out of balance, or the balance that we have in ourselves. And maybe before we go a little bit deeper, we talk about pain and we talk about trauma. What is trauma and what does it have to do with pain?
Yeah. Well, there's emotional pain and physical pain, and they're interrelated. And trauma, in my view, in my definition, is ultimately who we become after an event, when we lose connection to our essential self, the disconnection from the self, and how that creates distortions as a means, psychological and physical distortions, energetic distortions, as a means of coping with temporary or prolonged traumas, but how those distortions or coping mechanisms effectively in long term cause dis-ease of body and mind. And we can see that, and we can unpack that together and use a couple of examples that I can give and how that can influence someone's dis-ease.
And obviously you do outstanding work with individuals, but maybe to just get an understanding, if we talk about traumatic experience, or if we talk about that pain, how common is that? I don't know if you want to make an assumption on the US or on a global scale, but how many people do you understand or do you believe actually have had such an experience, traumatic or some painful, emotional and physical?
Yeah, well, I would say that by definition, we're all traumatized to one degree or another. Our separation from our mother as we leave the mother, and when we become cognizant of the fact that we are not the universe, that separation and loss of that idea that we are everything can be traumatic. The birth in of itself, by and large, in the Western world, is clinicalized, right? The mother is separated from the child, and there's a lot of trauma that happens on a subconscious level to many people, and that can impact people's lives for a very, very long time. Talking about men, most men are circumcised. That's an implicit memory trauma that can register on the nervous system. The trauma can be intergenerational. So our nervous system could be influenced by the trauma of the family that we come into, based on the trauma that our mothers take on as they bear us, how her hormonal levels may be out of balance, and how that actually influences the child in utero, and societal trauma. So there's many factors. I look at the biopsychosocial, spiritual, and energetic elements of being, and how those elements or factors can influence and be involved in our healing or wholeness, or can also contribute to our traumas, whether we are conscious of them or not.
And you have already given some hints at the Western world and the need to acquire and to conquer and to be strong, that this is all sources of pain and hence also of potential trauma. And you just mentioned intragenerational, and we also talked about intercultural trauma. So maybe we can look at those two one after another in a little bit more detail. What is this intragenerational trauma? So what you just explained and what I heard from it is that we get traumatic experience from one generation to the other, from my mother, from my father to me. And if I do not go in and do the work, let's say, then this may stick and I have the tendency or the capability to hand this trauma to the next generation.
Absolutely.
Is that a fair assumption? And do you want to talk to that a little bit?
That's a beautiful statement and a good foundational breakdown of what that is. So if we were to examine, let's look at a case study, if you will. So I work with a lot of influential, powerful families whose children are, to one degree or another, obviously affected by trauma. Yet the symptomology of the trauma is what's not accepted within the family. So it may present itself as alcoholism, substance abuse, or risk-taking behaviors, extreme sports, any extreme behavior as a means to soothe spike dopamine levels and remove oneself or extricate oneself from the pain, the discomfort, the predicament that people are in. Okay. So they come to me and say, well, my son's an alcoholic, or he's addicted to this substance or that substance, make it go away. And that in of itself is an interesting way for us to examine, make it go away. So these children tend to be sent off to boarding school at a very young age. They have separation trauma, but that separation trauma probably began from a very young age because they were given to nannies. The mothers weren't able to or equipped with the tools or had the know-how because of their history to care for these children. So there's an immediate separation, and that trauma, the trauma of abandonment. Okay, so the nervous system is thrown off balance. There's inherent pain, and these are high-performing, high-functioning families whose only value is the output and performance of their offspring, which schools they can go to, how much money they can make, and who they get married to. There's very little acknowledgement of their human experience, their own humanity, that as we discussed, can be very traumatic. Okay, and then their compensations, the compensations of these children who, at the point that I work with, are adults. I work with people from the age of 18 upwards, so young adults to adults who then are dealing with these distorted perceptions, subconscious or unconscious, and the compensations that they use to cope with the internal pain that they're not even aware of. And those beliefs, because these are families who have intergenerational wealth, those beliefs are passed on from their parents and so forth, hence intergenerational trauma. And intercultural trauma could also manifest as belief systems of a culture or a people. So I've worked with a lot of people of the Jewish faith, and as we both know, there's a lot of trauma there. And that just builds upon itself. So these are legacy burdens, dust upon dust, mud upon mud, that build and build and build. And unless someone has a breakdown and finds the resources and has the knowledge to access their truth within and heal from within, they will just continue propagating the same trauma to the next generations.
When you talked about potential or a typical client group, let's say, and you talk about, okay, they have inherited wealth over generations and inherited trauma potentially over generations. In many cases, the first step towards healing or towards at least acknowledging is the acceptance and the understanding that something is off. Maybe you can talk to that, how much it takes to accept that there might or might not be a trauma, or to accept that it's worthwhile investigating. I don't know if that's the right term, but this acceptance of that something is rather not normal, to quote you from the beginning. How is that the initiating factor, and how do you deal in regard to that with your clients, friends? I'm not sure what you call them.
So I call the people that I work with seekers. Yeah, so we seek to understand within and without. Clients, the word client to me seems very transactional and removed. I have a deep relationship with everyone that I work with, so I want to honor them as seekers. There are a lot of problems that we have in the Western society, and I'll use myself as an example and then answer your question. So talking about intergenerational trauma, I had my own trauma, and that was gifted to me by my family, my father namely, and I would like to acknowledge that I am the only person in my family that is currently on not on psychotropic medicines. Every single person in my family is on anti-anxiety and antidepressants. So it's clear and evident that there's this trauma. Trouble with most families is because my parents didn't have the know-how or the awareness to take me to someone who would be fully able to help me understand why these symptoms were presenting themselves. My dad was a perpetrator of my trauma, so he probably wouldn't have done it in the first place. Okay. But they took me to a psychiatrist, had a 20-minute conversation, and I got hopped up on a whole bunch of medication. And that was that. So if you were to acknowledge intergenerational trauma and intergenerational beliefs, most people are just medicated. There's a Band-Aid solution. And we talked about the many Band-Aid solutions that people resort to because they don't know that they can be researched from within to access their inner wisdom through various modalities, some being more effective than others. So that's my history. And for me to have found medicine work, to have done some deep work that I continue on doing to address my own traumas and heal from them, so that I'm moving forward and being of service in a clear fashion towards myself and the ones that I serve. So interculturally, or by and large, there is a manifestation of trauma presenting itself as hyperactivity, perfectionism, anxiety, depression, and some other more extreme mental disorders, which are addressed or tried to be healed through psychotropic medication. Some people do need those psychotropic medications. I was once on them, but by and large, they're short-term solutions for a larger and deeper problem. So to answer your question, when people come to me, they've been referred. In the past, until I started to speak publicly about my work, I was working only through referral basis, which I still pretty much do. People that had come to me had chronic pain, had marital discord, all rooted in trauma, the anxiety, depression, distorted self-beliefs. And some people were at the end of the line. Normal, common interventions weren't working until they discovered the work that I did, or the work that people do with psychedelics in general. And through those means found access to themselves and their inner wisdom and inner truth, and start to heal from within, not from without.
You talked about antidepressants and we talked about heavy medication at the example of yourself. And maybe we can talk to that a little bit, of course, respecting all the privacy of your seekers. But how many people go first to try to use that solution, that normal solution, and then for them find out that this may or may not be the best path? And I also talk on a very personal note because I know that from my very own family, and I dealt with that when I was a very small kid myself. And I would probably, based on that experience, also try to make people use not the normal so-called way, but to find alternative ways of healing. So your seekers, the people that you work with, how many of them have tried to go down the normal path and have figured out for themselves this is not really helping? And maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, by and large, all of them. To what degree, it varies. But Unfortunately, a lot of them had been medicated to no help. And there are times where people come to me and I have to work with their GPs, their psychiatrists, their physicians to help them titrate and actually come off the medication that they're on safely so that we can sit in medicine. Gabor said if antidepressants worked, why would people still be on them? You would take it short term, heal, and then move on. But as I acknowledged, the human experience is influenced by so many different factors. And I want to recognize that the challenges that people face on a day-to-day basis when they are living in a distorted reality, in a dysfunctional society, in a dysfunctional household, in a dysfunctional profession with bad eating habits, soothing compensation such as alcohol and various other substances that throw the body out of whack, throw the system out of whack. And what solution do you have? Most people don't have the luxury of going away for 4 or 5, 6, 7 days to work with me and then have the time to digest and then have the means and the interest or the willingness, the desire to actually quote unquote do the work of restructuring their internal systems and their external systems that lead them to more harmony. So what better way than to take some Zoloft and some Wellbutrin and go about your day? It's that quick fix solution that we all seek, that immediate gratification and the quick fix solution so we can go back to being normal, so then we can go and acquire more and find our happiness, which is a futile effort in my view.
No, thank you very much. And before we maybe take a closer look to what is wrong with the society, with the households, with the workspaces, with all those environments that we are creating, and also to lay down a little bit deeper the process by which you help seekers to gain more confidence about themselves and to also heal from within, talking about quick fix solutions. So we talked about antidepressants and medicine that most likely, in most of the cases, it's not a solution to take a pill and then you will feel better tomorrow, but that usually that can take weeks, months, years, decades to be a condition. And we also talked about other quick fix solutions. So if I do not feel so well, I just change my mind and I just believe that I don't have to think about my problems anymore. And there is different types, different people out there proclaiming different solutions. And I believe that this is also a difficulty because in this society where we have to be strong, we have to be functional, we don't want to be seen as somebody who has something abnormal, we try to stick, okay, I will just read this book or listen to this particular person or just try to numb my pain, just try to ignore my pain. I don't know if you have any thoughts on other quick fix solutions than just popping a pill.
Yeah, well, I wanted to make a little bit of a correction. In one of the statements that you made, antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication do work. And they take anywhere between a week or 2 weeks to 3 weeks to about a month to take effect. And as a temporary solution, I would be feeling anxiety if someone's shooting an AK-47 out the window. I don't care how much medicine, psychedelic medicines I'm on, I would be feeling anxiety. It's our nervous system informing us that there's danger and that we need to get the hell out. Okay. So to recognize the system as being dysfunctional. Okay, so living in New York City or having lived here for about 20 years. I wish it was 20 minutes.
Wishful thinking, I hear there. Wonderful.
20 years. And you get on the train and the screeching tracks, the noise, the tension. If you look at people as energetic beings, and recognizing that our nervous systems are completely shot, they're on sympathetic drive. We're just shot to all hell. And how else would we survive but to feel this anxiety because our systems communicating to us, run, so that you can survive this impending doom. So what better way to soothe it than pop a pill? Okay, so in recognizing the biopsychosocial, spiritual, and energetic, we realize that there's many problems that can contribute to this illness. And that's not even factoring in the trauma that's lying underneath in our subconscious. Okay, so as I said, like legacy burdens and legacy trauma is building on top of each other until someone gets to a point where they crack. Okay, the quick fix solutions in the coaching world or the self-help world or the guru world is very problematic to me, because they don't recognize the deeper reasons why people may be running into these conditions, these blockages. And by and large, it takes a lot of skill, understanding, training, years of experience to have a thorough understanding of why these things may be happening. And most people may not even be interested in examining those things within themselves, much less helping others examine those. And that's why good therapists come into play. Good therapists who are somatically informed, bottom-up informed, and helping people. So we have the Joe Dispenzas and Tony Robbinses and their whole ideology of, oh, you can outthink yourself out of this problem, and if you just meditate enough, you can manifest the stuff. And to me, that's absolutely irresponsible, and it might be reprehensible. And people gravitate towards that because, hey, I'm just going to go to this Tony Robbins thing for 4 days and spend $20K, and then I'll come away with this wisdom. And I don't mean to disparage some of the stuff that he says, because clearly he's been able to help people do the things that they seek to do. But if that's externally motivated, then it becomes problematic, because it's externally resourced. When I work with people, all I tell them that I do is help them find the key that's always been there. It's always within. And it may have been obstructed by the traumas that they may have experienced, but their essence and their truth and their access to their inner healing is within themselves. And once they access that, no one can take that away from them. Not me, not their partner, not their pastor or their rabbi, because it comes from within. It's that wellspring of the self. And that's the beautiful power that we all possess. Yet, because we've had dysfunctional fathers, for instance, who've valued us based on our performance as little league athletes, who've beaten us down emotionally, who've forced us to disconnect from our own emotions, we get into this place of self-abandonment and abandonment by our parents. And then we compensate by overachieving and becoming this productive people. And you're in the corporate world, I mean, it's all about productiveness. Microdose and you can become more productive. And I think it was Timothy Leary, I believe, who said it's the antithesis, this medicine work, and what these people in Silicon Valley are trying to do. Their motivation is completely in conflict, because once we connect to our essence and our truth, we realize that most of the things that we're doing are absolute absurdity and insanity. We remove ourselves from that insanity. Yet people are resorting to these microdose protocols or whatever in the business world to become more productive, which essentially bastardizes the wisdom of the medicine that they're taking. So I veered off a little bit, but did I answer that question thoroughly? Or
Absolutely, you did. And I think you opened another few very interesting doors in what you were just talking about, productivity. In fact, yesterday I read a book, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but it was about the Tao. And basically it talks about the harmony and the living beauty that each and every one of us possesses. So it's a different description of what you have summarized in the past few minutes. And the antithesis to the Tao is, in fact, setting goals and being productive. So by just putting ourselves into the state that we need to do this by then, that we need to reach a certain state by, creates a space where we cannot find this harmony. And for me, it was a very interesting theory. Let's just put it for now. But I hear similar talking points on your end that I mean, you talked about earlier, you have very wealthy clients at times. Maybe this is also that people in those circumstances can rather afford to look into different alternatives to heal and to different procedures. Okay, fine. But a lot of the external validation is in fact not the validation that creates happiness, that creates lasting harmony in our souls. And you said very nicely, like, you have to find this key inside of yourself, because only from within you're going to be able to heal. And I think then it plays back to the acceptance, right? You have to accept that you search for this key inside. Then you find somebody like yourself and you work with that person, and you may or may not find this key, because I can imagine, I don't know, maybe that's a spontaneous question that comes to my mind, but how often does it actually happen that you work with clients and you realize, okay, this acceptance is not there, they don't want to find this inside key, and they spend a week with you or 2 weeks with you, and they just bounce back to the condition where they have been before? I don't know if there's any thoughts.
Really good question. So at some point in our talk, I'd like to talk about the medicines that I work with and how that those medicines get into the accessing of the key within. But to answer this question, which is a pertinent question, is a very, very important question, which is, once someone discovers the root cause of their suffering and their trauma and their relationship to that trauma, then it requires, and that can happen spontaneously in medicine work because the mind is open and the body is open. And this is more late stage work that happens because sometimes people have to repress their trauma so much that working with these medicines actually just helps them be in the presence of their traumas, in full acceptance of what was, and to acknowledge those things. That's why I have a good team of people that I work with, therapists, people who are in IFS, who work with other modalities that help people distill that truth, acknowledge that truth, and work with shifting their relationship with that truth. Because while we may acknowledge and become friends with our history, it doesn't diminish or make the history go away. It just helps us reframe and reshape and re-relate with that trauma and our response to that trauma, and who we were and who we can become as a means of healing, because you can't escape your body and your mind until you finally leave. So it requires some radical shifts in relation to self, to others, relationship to your body, relationship to your parts, relationship to your soul, and the soul's relationship to you. And so to answer that question further, there are times where people get the memo, get the letter, and it's very difficult for them to accept those things. It's easier to go back to version 1.0, as most people are in, as opposed to acknowledging the things and wanting to make the radical shifts. And they don't need to happen immediately, but with personal involvement and investment in yourself through various modalities to make those shifts. And sometimes those shifts are pretty big. Shifts in relationship, shifts in profession, shifts in places of where people live. So those things can be very big. And sometimes people are so entrenched in the system that they were part of that it's hard to extricate. So I don't advocate for, okay, leave your $500,000 job, leave your wife, leave your kids, and go live in the mountains, because that would damage a lot of people and hurt a lot of people in the process. So how do we responsibly do this and make the shifts within so that we can also create harmony outside? But by and large, most people get the memo and work towards their healing over time.
Okay, no, that's good to hear. But as you said, like, I think it can make such a profound enlightenment that you hear, okay, well, now I need to change quite a few things over time. Okay, maybe, but still I could imagine that some people say, okay, well, my version 1.0 yeah, I had some pain, I had some trauma, but I can just numb that again and go back. But it's very good to hear that most of the seekers that you work with actually acknowledge that there is work to be done. And I mean, that's maybe also for the audience, it's my assumption, maybe you have a thought on that. But I think what's also important to understand is all of us have work to be done, and all of us have things to go through, right? And obviously, I would like to spend quite some time actually on the medicine that you use and that you take people on journeys with, let's just call it. In our pre-talk, again, we talked about the chocolate ice cream example, and maybe you want to enlighten our audience a little bit what you mean with that, and maybe we can use that as a segue to talk about practical experience with different medicines.
Yeah. So I like Haagen-Dazs. What's your favorite ice cream brand?
Oof, I'm not so much of a sweet person, but Haagen-Dazs does taste very well. I must say I'm fully plant-based by now, but I've seen that I believe Ben & Jerry's by now has vegan ice cream. I haven't checked it, but I will try and let you know how I like
Okay,
it.
so let's go Ben and Jerry's. And what are we talking, like vanilla or chocolate or
Rather
coffee?
chocolate. Rather chocolate.
Chocolate. Okay, so Ben and Jerry's chocolate vegan ice cream.
Let's go for it.
Okay, let's go for it. All right. So I don't know what Ben and Jerry's chocolate vegan ice cream tastes like. You could tell me about it. You yourself could be like, well, it's cold, and I could know what cold is. It's sweet and it's got this texture, and I could imagine it. Now imagine, Esmo, this is telling me, and I'm some guy that grew up in a tribe in the Amazon. I have no foundational understanding of what any of this is. I know what cold is because I've been in the river. Maybe I know what sweet is because I've had some fruit that's sweet, but that's kind of where it stops. So it's only through our visceral understanding of the experience that we can come to our own truth about what we're talking, what the matter is. And the remarkable thing about doing medicine work is that it gets us into our visceral truth about what it is that we need to recognize and heal from within. You could tell me about chocolate ice cream and read 10,000 books to me about Ben and Jerry's and chocolate ice cream and all the treaties that have been written on chocolate ice cream, and yet I would not get it. And what's remarkable about medicine work is it gives us that visceral truth from within that we have a deep relationship with because it's lived inside.
And it also gives us the possibility to potentially rewire our nervous system and to not only theoretically build knowledge about a condition or talk therapy. And talk therapy has its reason to belong, obviously. But I believe when I talk to other people, also and potentially to you, about psychedelic medicine, which I would like to detail in a bit, is this practical experience really has the ability to change something in our nervous system for the better. We know much better how our nervous system is being created and is being traumatized. And maybe we can use that as an entry door to talk about what different medicines are out there. Why do you choose the different medicines that you work with? And what can we actually accomplish with them?
Yeah, good question. And that requires a week, which we don't have. So, so I'll briefly lay out the medicines that I work with and how they may be helpful to people. And there's many different factors, and I'm just touching on a few. And I encourage everyone who's listening to do their due diligence and definitely research the medicines that they are attracted to, whether I talk about them or not, and the facilitators who offer these medicines. It takes a lot of care and responsibility to work with these medicines. So I wanted to preface what I'm about to share with the audience with this. So I work with about 5 or 6 different medicines. Some have a psychedelic effect, others may not. So I work with Sananga, I work with Hape, and these are in order of difficulty or the complexity, and all of them are very complex in themselves respectfully. I work with 2CB. I work with 5-MeO-DMT, and I work with psilocybin. Now, there are people who come to me who have more extreme parts, let's call it that. So there may be presentations of dissociation. There may be presentations of borderline or bipolar. And beyond that, I'm not skilled enough to work with, and it's not advised that people with other disorders work with psychedelics. Because of the nature of the work that I do, because I work foundationally on this idea of trauma, MDMA is by and large the first medicine that I introduce to the people that I work with, in conjunction with Hape and Sananga. Hape being an Amazonian tobacco-derived medicine, and Sananga also being used by hunters, and that kickstarting the nervous system. So those are the first three medicines that I introduce to people when I sit with them, and it has a really, really beautiful way of softening the default mode network, our conscious thinking part, and definitely softening our amygdala, our fear response. And a lot of people, whether their nervous system has been dysregulated, so they have anxiety, amygdala, whether they have chronic pain and trauma from surgeries, amygdala. So softening that and allowing people to sit with themselves after a long time. What's really remarkable about MDMA as a spirit medicine is that it has the capacity to open up the structural body parts. It has the capacity to open up the mind as the witness. It has the capacity to help us access the spirit world, and it has the capacity to help us access various states of consciousness. Those being dosage dependent, those being dependent on where the seeker is in their healing process and how much work they've done in being able to arrive to the ceremony and what presents itself. So the work that I do is not very rigid in the protocol that I use, the dosage that I use, the medicine orders that I use, because every person is unique. Every person has their own trauma. The trauma presents itself in medicine differently. Their psyche in relationship to the medicine can respond and react differently. So there's many factors that need to be considered in facilitating a healing ceremony for someone to be able to fully be with themselves and process these things out and then unburden these beliefs and so forth. But it can be a very big thing. And what's interesting for men, for instance, is men have pushed it down, shoved it down, and they've become numb. So when you give them permission to be with their emotions, it's just an explosion of just, oh my God. And I criticize people who herald this MDMA as this heart-opening, butterflies and roses and rainbows and unicorns medicine, because in essence, it actually gives us and our protectors permission to soften up and for us to actually notice what's underneath. And there could be rage, there could be shame, there could be guilt, there could be a lot of unpleasant things on an emotional level, and how that presents to us in a physical level. Rage being stuck in our liver, in our diaphragm, and all different parts of our body. And finally, for us to be able to actually express that rage in a healthy fashion, in a safe fashion. I just did this with someone who wasn't able to express their rage for 54 years of their life.
That's quite some time. So yeah, thank you very much for that explanation, Payam. I have quite a few follow-up questions, but what I really loved is, first of all, thank you for also acknowledging that there are limitations of yourself and also of the work with psychedelics and with certain medicine. The second one is, the caution, I think, is to the utmost important, right? So do research and do find a facilitator who goes on that journey together with yourself. I don't even want to spend too much time on recreational drug usage in today's podcast episode, because as you said, I think we want to lay this medicine and the practices that we do, want to know more about. And 2-3 questions that came when you were talking anyways is, okay, so now I find Payam, or I find a facilitator that I can go on this journey together with. And I use either of those 5 medicines or another 3, let's say. How much of an ongoing process or of a one-time activity is such a journey? Meaning, okay, I do the journey with you now. We have October 2022. Is it likely that I will work with you for the next 40 years? Is it likely that over the next 2-3 years we will meet up and heal more and more and more? Or how does that work? Is it like you're opening one door and then there is a lot of more doors coming, or any experience sharing you want to?
Yeah, good question and good challenge. And I invite you to challenge me personally or the work that I do. I think it's in the interest of discourse that we speak mutually, respectfully, but also challenge each other or ask challenging questions, because that motivates me to explain these things in a clear fashion. So I use a lot of levity in the work that I do, because I deal with so much fucking shit. And I'm going to use this word because it's just unbelievable, the level of trauma that children are given that they didn't choose. It's unbelievable. And I try to be very, very gentle with my own response, but I see the collateral damage of parents who traumatize their children because they were addicted to drugs and all sorts of things. Okay. So using levity, because we have to laugh, we have to actually embrace the joy. And when people are in ceremony, they're screaming and they're puking and they've lost it all. It's a time for celebration, because finally, here we go. Finally, it's something that we can release with permission. Okay. So in acknowledging levity and joy, when I work with people, I say, once I'm done working with you, I hope to never see you again. Because you got the memo, you got the key, you got the tools, go live your life. That's what I wish for you. And that's what distinguishes the work that I do. And I like to think that's how I distinguish myself from a lot of other people, because I'm not here to dangle a carrot about in front of someone's face and say, hey, if you just pay me for this master class or for this workshop, for this or that, then you'll get it. That being acknowledged and recognized, there are people who have so much trauma, so much repressed and pushed down, that it requires some time to open up in medicine and recognize these things and then slowly work with them. Okay. I recognize also the sovereignty of every person that I work with. I recognize their humanity and their individuality. And I do that by always asking them to use critical thinking, listen to what I'm saying. If something doesn't resonate or something puts them in a fear state, always bring it up to me, because we're partners in this relationship. I'm experienced. I understand the medicines. I understand how they work, but we need to come to an agreement about how we work with these medicines, how far and how deep we go with them, the dosage protocol and so forth, because it's irresponsible as a facilitator, in my view, to push someone into a place where their psyche cannot handle the material that the psyche witnesses, or these protective pieces. And I can disorient someone or put them in temporary psychosis, or the medicines can reveal things to people that may be traumatizing. So the experience of being in the medicine can be traumatizing, and the trauma that rises up can be traumatizing. So here we are adding more trauma on top of trauma. So it's not incumbent on me to do that to someone. Okay, that's why I spend approximately 4 days, 2 days of ceremony work and two days of rest work, or sometimes longer, depending on other variables, namely availability, finances, and how and which medicines we work with, and what presents itself, to slowly excavate so that they can witness and be able to work with the material that presents itself. And working with MDMA and some of these medicines do take a physical toll. It takes an emotional toll and a psychological toll. So we need to work very slowly with these medicines so we don't destroy ourselves in medicine, in ceremony, whether I'm sitting or the seeker. So to answer your question, sometimes people work with me once and they get the memo, and that's good. And then they have the team that I have to support them, or I work with their therapists, and they go on with their lives. And sometimes because there's so much that's happened, it takes some time. I think the longest relationship that I've had with someone has been over the course of a year and a half, during which I saw them every quarter, so maybe 6 times.
Because there was a lot of intercultural, intergenerational, there was a lot of different trauma, a lot of different layers to take care of.
And I don't want people to resort to doing medicine work as the next thing. I don't want people to become workshop hoppers and just then do medicine work as a means to be in this state. And something happens, like their kid doesn't eat spinach and the wife starts screaming and they're like, well, I got to sit down with you. First of all, I wouldn't do that. And people that come to me understand it, so they wouldn't. But it seems to be pretty prevalent in the ayahuasca world. And the ayahuasca world is a beautiful world that I'm not part of. My friends, some of them are facilitators, some people work with this medicine, and it's very communal, it's very healing. It's a medicine I do want to work with personally for my own personal work. But if any medicine is used as a means to escape oneself, then it's defeated its own purpose, and it's being used disrespectfully. So we have to recognize that and acknowledge that and be cautious of that.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much for that clarification once more. And you just called it workshop hoppers, and I noted down earlier the facilitators and irresponsibility, and that was a question, and I believe you gave the answer that you also experienced that. But what I see sometimes in my bubble, or like in people surrounding, that it becomes another game, and we may now call it for the ego or for competition or for whichever other purpose, but very externally driven purposes, that you've tried this medicine, you've tried the heaviest, the hardest, the fastest, the most often. Is that something that you in fact see people behaving in this way? And what is, maybe a few words on that, or why should people maybe not follow that path to compete in regard to medicine usage?
Yeah. Beautiful question. I'm glad you pointed it out. Alan once said ego loss is the biggest ego trip. And there's that quote encapsulates and answers the question that you put forth, but I'll expand on that. And I've seen that quite a bit, where people have these unifying non-dual experiences, and it's all fine and good, and we get it, and I've been there, and I am God and you are God, and so is the computer and the electric currents that are creating this experience. Yes, we are all God, but then we have to come back down to you being you and me being me in this body, and navigating and negotiating the F train to get to Adorama to pick up the mic, and having to deal with cuts and bruises on the way. So how do we deal with our own humanity? Okay. And that's really what it boils down to is yeah, we may have had enlightening experiences, and yes, I know that on a different level of existence, we are all one consciousness and all that. But I had this experience personally where I was out of character, and I want to recognize this because I think it's very, very important. I recognize my own humanity and my own fallibility, my own weakness. I am no greater than anyone else that comes to me. And if, as a facilitator, someone presents themselves that way, you may want to be very cautious about working with them, because it's in recognition of our own humanity and the darkness and the light, and how balanced we can be, and how we can be in equanimity. That's really where someone may be trustworthy to work with. Yet my partner's daughter was bullied in school. She was spat at, and we went to the school in Holland where they live, and I because of my own history of being beaten by bullies and so forth. And the administration has this no blame policy. And I called them out on it. And I basically said, hey, look at my face and look at my eyes. If anyone harasses her and you guys don't do anything about it, I will. And that was the beginning of the conversation. And as fate would have it, the kid who spat at her was running late to class and he was outside. I've been trained in martial arts for many years. I've had a very illustrious, interesting experience with life and done things. I blacked out and I was in this kid's face and I threatened to kill him if he ever touched her again. And I don't regret it. It was out of character. But when we as human beings are in this predicament where our families become threatened, then we recognize that as men of at what stage do we let go of I'm the guru and the teacher and we are one and address an immediate threat. So we have to recognize all of our humanity, the darkness and light, and try to be in balance. That's my wish to help people get there. So workshop hopping and running to the next big thing and the ego loss and all that, those are all the perils of doing any medicine work. And in my view, the best thing you can do is walk gently on this earth and love and compassion as best as possible and hurt the fewest amount of people and hopefully help the most that you can. And that's our human condition in this body at this present moment.
No, thank you very much for that. And I believe, and you may or may not talk to that a little bit, but it's also about acknowledging the ego much rather than wishing or trying to destroy the ego. I don't know if you have any thoughts, particular explicit thoughts on that.
We have to be in ego. We have to be in a dual state to be able to function in this body. If I was in a non-dual state, I wouldn't be able to feed myself and I'd die. And I'm planning on being on this planet for some time. It's not about killing the ego. While it may be really beautiful to have a non-dual experience with 5-MeO-DMT, that's not going to solve your problems. And it's not really going to solve your relationship with yourself and may not solve your relationship with your traumas. And that's why working with softer medicines such as 2CB and MDMA helps you be present to yourself while you're able to work through your traumas and reprogram, reestablish, re-relate, right? Recontextualize, reprioritize, and in recognizing your compensations and realizing that those compensations were actually hurtful long-term. It's not about ego death.
And I believe this is also why it's called psychedelic integration rather than psychedelic experience making. So you really need to take what you've learned in a certain state of mind and take that into reality and be able to also use that in reality, preferably for your better, let's just say, or for even humanity's better, right? But it's not only about making experiences and jumping around, but it's really about, okay, what can we learn from those experiences and how can that have a lasting effect, first on yourself, but in the meantime, potentially even on the bigger picture, on other humans around us and maybe on the whole society.
Yeah, I would say the integration piece of doing ceremonial work is, if not as important, more important than the ceremony in of itself. Okay, so the protocol, the way I work is I refer the people who come to me to one of the people on my team, whatever practice, whether it's somatic experiencing IFS, whatever modality that's resonant with them, or I speak with their therapist, get a good understanding of their system and what they're coming in with and understand their bodies and minds. That's the beginning point. Then I take probably 2 calls over a span of about an hour and a half to address the troubles that they're coming to me with, what I know about them, things that they may not have shared with people on my team or the therapist that they felt was too private, creating the space, designing the ceremony, understanding what medicines we may work with. Then we sit in ceremony. A lot of the integration happens to happen in the work because of the rest days, because it to me is a one day ceremony, just happens to take place over the course of 4 days or 5 days. It's just a one continuous experience. And then then working with the team or whomever they choose to use integrative practices to make it gel and stick, and for those changes that need to be made to be catalyzed. So that's quite important in the work.
Absolutely. And then also, I suppose to have a partner, a facilitator, or at least a friend, a person that one may or may not contact afterwards, right? So if we've done our session together and 2 weeks later, I feel that I need to discuss something, probably you also give support, or your team also gives support to this very need to work on something after the ceremony itself, right?
Yeah,
this integration work.
Yeah, I'm always available to the people that I work with. They can always reach me should I be available, because sometimes I'm off the map, all too well, because I'm tending to some other person. But to have a good therapist or a good integration practitioner that actually uses a modality that's effective. Here's the trouble with the medicine world, and I'm almost tempted to say that the trouble is also a benefit, but nothing's standardized. People can call themselves a master psychedelic integration guru or whatever. They can, and people do label themselves all sorts of stuff. And then you go there and tell them about childhood trauma, and they're not trauma trained. They're like, well, just write a manifestation list and meditate and manifest it, and give someone a bullshit integration tip and trip, and then send them on the way. And people are left lost and abandoned and forlorn. Whereas if you're working with someone who understands the nature of the medicines that the person has worked with, what's been revealed, what part of their psyche is activated, dissociations that start to happen again because of the protectors turning up, and learning to really, really help people effect long-lasting change. So going back to the credentialing of this world, if we were to credential people through the Western paradigm, it would limit and exclude so many different pieces of wisdom in medicine work. So I encourage people to do a lot of research, understand what the modalities that these people work with, and if they can be effective, and if they can have a relationship that's resonant, that feels safe in the heart. That's not simply sexy and beautiful and I'm not going to name names, but there are people who call themselves all of these things and selling their sexuality and their beautiful looks and the places they go to, Bali, and they're coaches, and they couldn't coach themselves out of a Matchbox if you really asked them to.
No, and I think that's a very, very important remark you give, and maybe we can even make that more explicit. I don't know if you have tips or hints if somebody is listening and they either have been already doing some research or they're looking into people, as in you called it earlier, you understand medicine and you understand the power of medicine, which I believe is something that each and everybody who helps seekers taking medicine, going on journeys with, should really understand. But how can people understand, okay, this is a red flag, or this is, I'm not asking for a checklist, okay, those 5 bullets should be checked, right? But is there certain things that people can be aware of when doing their research? Is it in the end their gut feeling that they, with Payam I have a very good feeling, or I don't? Is it the certificates, which I suppose it's not, because it's not a westernized system? But how can people be cautious? Because again, I want to make that remark, one has to be cautious with all the traditional medicines, but how can people try to find the best facilitator for themselves, really?
Yeah, very good question. On my website, I have a link, and I put it on my website on the resources page, because I want people, this is the thing I stress over and over and over again, okay? That what I say, what my message is, what my methodology is, the way I speak, the way I present myself needs to be resonant with the person who comes to me. So when I work with someone calls me because they've been referred, I give them 45 minutes to an hour of my time. Why? Because I want to make a good distinction about the way that I work, what my feeling is towards them, and what their feeling is towards me. I don't discuss my rates or my fees. And I say to people, this is a relationship that needs to be forged, okay? And it needs to be forged fundamentally based on comfort level, based on your resonance with what I'm saying. And if there is no resonance, if there is suspicion or fear, acknowledge that and honor that. Because I'm not in the capacity to work with every single person and be for every single person's guide or healer or facilitator, because some people may be attracted to some other facilitators for their own needs. And you may want to look at that. Are you attracted to this person because they have beautiful tattoos on their bodies and are handsome or beautiful? Or are you attracted to them because they're speaking authentically, truthfully, they recognize their limitations, they share their history, that they don't have a God complex, that they speak articulately about the work that they do, and that they just didn't arrive. When I meet someone who's 25 years old and says that they're a life coach and they're running corporate retreats, and I'm left to wonder, you just arrived and you're just coming to possibly the end of your biological maturation, not even your emotional, psychological, and spiritual maturation. So how does one really believe that they're in the capacity to help people? And it leaves me a little curious, and it's very suspect. So fundamentally, these are some of the very basic things that should be recognized and questioned for a person who does integration or some sort of coaching, whatever their modality is, and authenticity and truth. I speak the way I speak. Obviously, we're using different language, and this is more of a formal conversation, but I talk the way I talk. I am who I am, and you like it, you're great. And if you don't like it, that's okay too. I'm not here to put on a part, right? One of my parts to be activated, and then for me to play out this part in an genuine way, for me to appease the wishes of the seeker. And then that becomes a very dysfunctional relationship, right? And then it's transference and counter transference and all these dysfunctions that happen and that get elevated and highlighted, accelerated in medicine work. And you can end up doing a lot more harm than good to people. And the other piece is, how did you find this person? Did you go to shamans.com and find the one that had the best rating? Maybe that's the way to go. Or was this person someone who was referred because this person is a man or a woman of integrity?
Absolutely. I'm actually going to check if there is something like shamans.com. No, just kidding. But what you say makes very perfect sense. And what I believe, or what I choose to hear, is, let's say 4 of my very close friends would recommend me, Payam, as the person to facilitate me through this very journey. And we have a call, and we do not feel a good bond, and we do not get along, and I don't feel that, then probably this doubt or this inauthenticity will also have an effect if I would still decide to pursue, right, and go into this integration. So maybe this is another factor that we can hint people. If you do feel off balance, if you do feel uncomfortable, well, then there is some truth to that, even though that person may or may not be a very good facilitator for other people. But I believe, maybe you can talk to that, but
there's a caveat. If you're uncomfortable working with someone, you should terminate that relationship, period. Ultimately, it's about your healing. Now, here's a little bit of a caveat. It's actually a large caveat, and something that people should acknowledge within themselves. I have worked with people who've gone to therapists that they fired because the therapist pointed the light towards this person about their system that they were not willing to accept or recognize and work with. So they got fired. This is an actual experience of someone who I work with. So they would go through therapists, because these therapists would say, hey, by the way, XYZ, and they'd be like, no, you're fired. So they came to me. And we went into medicine work, and guess what? Even in medicine work, these protective pieces turned up, and it was a very challenging few days. She went into psychosis, and we were working with different medicines, and it was a very interesting experience. But once we came back and we had a long conversation, and I just used this word, can you be curious about that experience? And it took me an hour and a half to help her understand what it meant to get curious about an experience. And after some time, I just told her, I said, I don't think I'm the right person for you. And medicine work may not be the right modality for you to heal, because the protectors were so vehemently in place that even when medicine was revealing things, she wasn't willing to work with it. So that being said, there may be times where a facilitator such as me, because I do make calls and point things out to people, and I can be somewhat strict sometimes, because these protector pieces come in and cause a little bit of a mess. And then if you're in ceremony space, that ceremony space still needs to be contained to a certain degree. So to have someone, and that's why I even encouraged and called it out between our conversations, be like, let's challenge each other respectfully and lovingly, because that's only the time when we start to grow, is where we share the views and opinions that may differ from one another, but then those views and opinions may actually highlight blind spots, if you will, and areas of consideration where there were none before for either person in the conversation.
No, I absolutely agree to that. If we would all share the same experience, the same beliefs, and the same approaches, then probably we would not heal as much trauma, and probably we would have very different conversations. So I think this is also one of the facts why we have those conversations, to learn from each other, to respect from each other. And to me personally, the best thing that can happen is if somebody respectfully challenges what we talk about, even if somebody in the audience listens to that and says, I have had very different personal experience over the past year, over the past 30 years, please do contact Payam and myself, share your knowledge, your experience, and then we can have an open discussion and learn from one another, right? So we have this openness to be honest, to be direct, and to learn from each other. There's not this one solution and it's your way, or one solution and it's my way. There's a lot of different interpretations. And anyways, there is 8 billion different truths running around on this planet. And in the end, this is what it's all about. But I think it's really to listen to each other and to learn from each other, and to acknowledge also that we do not know each and everything, and that there's different modalities for different people.
Yeah, so that's very important. And I'm going to reiterate this, is the recognition, the fundamental recognition of the relative reality that we all exist in this state of consciousness that we're sharing as well, that relative reality, because I cannot be everyone and everything at the same time. And I'm using the experiences that I've had to inform the way I speak and what I speak about. And that's why I recognize every person that I've worked with, because every single one of them has been my teacher.
No, it's always two-sided, right? So you learn from each and everybody, and everybody learns from you. Each and every interaction we have with people helps us, and all of our realities are, in fact, very different. So thank you very much for the emphasis on that remark as well. And Payam, we talked a little bit also about therapists, and we talked about different modalities, and we talked about medicine work to a certain extent, to a certain detail. And maybe we just want to clarify or discuss a little bit, how much do they add up to each other, or do they supplement each other? Would you say, okay, you should at least have 2 years of talk therapy before you go into medicine work? Or do you say you should definitely not have more than 1 year of talk therapy? Is there such numbers, or is that again very individual? Meaning, there is very different modalities out there, and there is likely to be the best set for Payam, there's likely to be the best set of Ishmael, but how is it also acknowledging the different modalities and playing with them? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think that choosing a therapist wisely is very important. Are you choosing a therapist for them to validate your truth? Are you choosing a therapist that may challenge you and actually encourage you, not force you, to encourage you to look at yourself and make shifts? There's different forms of therapy. I'll use this example with all due respect, because I'm not a psychoanalytic therapist. But in my experience with one, I worked with someone, we worked together in the desert, and this person had intergenerational trauma, just, the whole thing that I explained. And then we worked with 5-MeO DMT and MDMA. And it was just sort of this remarkable experience. And I got on a call to help this therapist understand, to help in a few very futile fashions, as I soon found out, to help him understand what that experience was like and what was revealed. It's very, very hard to explain a very, very beautiful peak experience with a medicine such as 5-MeO. It's almost impossible. So I explained things, what had shown up, and we were trying to talk for about 45 minutes. And he then took what I was trying to explain, which was this very, very big thing. And the seeker who I was working with, obviously being there present and sharing, he took what we were sharing, which was like a cloud of information, and trying to put it in the framework that he knew and box it up and be like, oh yeah, so that was that, and using symbology, which it works in medicine, and recontextualizing for my seeker the truth that he had based on the therapist's understanding, which broke down. And I was like, all right, and that was the end of that conversation. So certain modalities in therapy work a lot better with medicine work. Others may not be that great. I'm a very big proponent of bottom up, so somatic experiencing, somatic IFS. These modalities tend to be really, really effective in helping us connect with the human experience, the being part, the experiences of what our body does, and the emotions and the traumas that we've stored in our body, and helping the body part connect to the mind part, and learning how to recognize the triggers and body response, the meanings that we carry in, and harmonizing those things. That being said, there are people who've never had therapy that have worked with me, and there are people who've had 20 years of therapy. I'll use this other case. This person who I worked with would be very dissociated, and she was medicated for about 20 years of her life. Okay, so we go in and get on the mat. Long story short, she had birth trauma where she nearly died because the umbilical cord got wrapped around the neck. Implicitly, the body wanted to leave, the soul wanted to leave. And we recognized that in medicine, and she validated this by contacting her mother. But we did the work, and guess what? The dissociation went away. She got off of her medication because there was an update of the system that the body belongs, or the soul belongs in the body, and vice versa. And it was a lot of work. But she also had 20 years of therapy and a whole bunch of medication to no avail. Okay. I don't think it's a bad idea to see a therapist and help yourself, but really see, is this really being effective, or am I just showing up and doing maintenance conversations for 45 minutes? And is this person really effective and really in themselves? Are they experienced? Have they had life experience? Are they just coming out of school, or do they have a lot of gray? Okay, so there's a lot of factors, and ultimately it's about helping someone heal.
I actually have another question when we talk about that and talk about trauma, and this 45 minutes actually brought me there. And I was listening to the audiobook of Oprah Winfrey, What Happened to You? And it's also on trauma, and I'm paraphrasing here as well. And I don't know if that is a dead end or if we're going to explore something. But basically what one of the notions is, if we have had trauma, and if we are aware of having had trauma, it is for humans, at least in the beginning, super difficult if not impossible, to focus on that trauma for 45 minutes. It's actually a fairly long period. So you would go in, if you are a practitioner, and for 2 or 3 minutes, talk about that trauma, shine light on the trauma, and then incrementally increase the amount that you actually want to talk about. Because what can happen if there's a trauma and I'm not aware of it, and you find it and you go so deep that it's too much for my nervous system to deal with. Again, I don't know if it's a dead end or if you have any thoughts on that, but I found that very interesting of a perspective.
So many examples that are tragic. Well, what I believe you're pointing to is exposure therapy, incrementally working towards it and so forth. And yeah, that could work. Yes, the protectors could soften. Yes, so forth and so on. A lot of the traumas and our experiences with the traumas or our compensations or our relationship with those traumas have been so far repressed and put into the unconscious mind that it's really hard to access those things. That's why working with a medicine such as MDMA, it can soften the body. And I've worked with people who have gone through a lot of medicine work before they found me. So I should point this out, that a lot of the people that come to me, there are people, as I mentioned, who are now becoming aware of my work, and there are people in the medicine world all over the world that come to me because they've done work, but then they've hit a wall, or they've approached the door and have not been able to step through the door and actually work with their stuff. And that's why MDMA can be really beautiful and effective in dealing with trauma, as I mentioned earlier in the talk. So a lot of this this cognitive, self-referential therapeutic experiences are limited in that people are in a self-referential state of consciousness blended with the parts that are active, and very hard to extricate yourself. Where the medicine, depending on how it works with you, there's Payam and Payam witnessing Payam, and many levels of Payam above that, and then becomes no Payam because it's absolute consciousness. And then above that is that unitary consciousness. And then there's no nothing, and no nothing is everything, which is hard to do any therapeutic work in that space.
And maybe what you've just started to outline a little bit, I would be interested, without getting too abstract, but we also talked about harmony, and we also in our pre-talk talked about something like awakening. And maybe you can just give us a few thoughts what in fact, through the usage of different medicine, through the usage of having the right facilitator, can happen, and what this awakening and harmony would mean to you, but also would mean to the world.
God, I wish everyone could just wake up one day. But waking up one day, in my view, is waking up to the human condition, the darkness and the light. It's not like you're going to go and enter the field of butterflies and roses. And we can get into some of the metaphysical things, which will require a lot more time. In my view, the ones who are awakened are in a state of harmony, not in a form of false positivity and spiritual materialism, but again, embodying themselves and their humanity in the best way possible, while dealing with the kid that still doesn't eat spinach and the bully that spat at your partner's daughter and wanting to kill them, which was me. And that to me is enlightenment, because we are aware of our true essence and all of that which it encapsulates, and being able to dance of life and walk peacefully on this earth, and hopefully not screw people up in the process, which we all need to do, because we're on a collision course to absolute destruction.
So, Payam, we talked about medicine quite a bit, and we talked about our egos, and we talked about different types of facilitators. But in the beginning, we hinted at the systematic issues or difficulties that we have, and also the protection that us men have in this society and the roles that we play, and a lot of pain and trauma that is the result of such. So maybe we can use that as a final topic for today's discussion, and I'm more than happy to have around 2 and 7 and 15. But if we talk about the role of a strong man, of a strong human, what are your thoughts on that? And what is maybe also ways that we have to relearn or rethink our understanding of such?
Well, let's examine what it means to be a man in this culture. And let's examine together what it means to be a strong businessman. And you've been in the corporate sector, and I'd like you to reflect back to me, based on your understanding of the work that I do and what we discussed, what a strong man is in the corporate sector, and how we can distill that and unpack that in the recognition fundamentally that we are all trying our best, but our best may not be enough. And let's recognize some of that, and then we can distill and understand what those may be.
No, absolutely. And I mean, again, I can speak for my very own personal experience, and I'm fully aware that there's different companies, different businesses, and different people out there. But I think there is common traits or characteristics that companies, let's just call it, are searching for in the business world. And you have to be smarter. You don't have to be only smart. You have to be smarter than other people. You have to be stronger, at least at the very beginning of your career. What happens in the environments where I have worked, you're being tested straight away. So how does Ismail deal with weekend work? How does the person deal with working 14 or 16 hours straight? How does the person deal with saying no? And also and I believe that happens consciously and subconsciously, how does a person stand its ground if he or she has to do something which may not be in line with those values? So there is a lot of pressure, I would just call it, that are being put on men and women in the business world, but which people have to go through for an initial beginning of their career. But it doesn't really matter. You go higher and higher and higher. And it's also true on a partner level if we talk about investment banks or if we talk about management consultants. Again, this is the areas where I used to work. And you have to be strong, you have to be smarter, you have to be faster. And if you break at either of those characteristics, you can also be sure that there is thousands, if not millions, of other people replacing you. So you are replaceable at any time. And there is a lot of fear as well being put on man and being put on human capital, let's just call it, because that's really what it is. Like, people invest, a company invests in a Payam or in an Ishmael, and then the likelihood is that people are only searching for the best monetary output of that very resource. And for me, that is a fairly skewed view of what humanity really is. And I hope that that gave you an idea of what my understanding of a strong businessman would be.
So what I hear as you're saying this is the equivalent of boot camp and being put into the battlefield. You're disposable. You're just a number. Your humanity is denied of yourself. You're forced to deny yourself of your own humanity. And you may be rewarded monetarily or by, a medal, a badge. And when you break, you're out because there's 15 other people behind you ready to go. So fundamentally, what I'm hearing you say is that you're entering into an environment where you have to deny yourself of your own humanity, and your humanity is denied of yourself. And people compensate by drinking, they compensate by buying, they compensate by a lot of distorted behaviors and beliefs to manage that environment. As I mentioned before, doing medicine work really forces us to reevaluate ourselves and our priorities and our paradigms. And it may not be for many people, because they realize that they're in an insane world and they're participating in their own insanity and their own destruction. I really encourage people to read the new book by Gabor, because it really has a good way of elucidating all these ills. Okay. On the opposite, on the flip side of the coin, I have worked with businessmen and very, very prominent surgeons, world-renowned surgeons, and they get the memo and they're like, holy fucking shit. And I asked them afterwards, I say, so now what? And while they may be still involved in the sector that they're in, they're doing their work with more humility and humanity. It's more of a humanistic approach. And this really ties in, this is really beautiful. The ethos that you're trying to elucidate in the work that you do, and essentially the work that I do, is the change from within, whether it's an interpersonal or personal process, or whether it's a process in a corporation. And I jokingly said to you, I want to infiltrate the corporate sector and help them commit to their own humanity, connect to their own humanity, commit to that humanity, commit to that truth, and possibly shift ever so slightly so that they can recognize the fundamental humanity of every human being that is dedicated to the work that they're doing, and possibly dedicated to, and that may possibly shift the ethos or the dedication of the company and the work that they're trying to do on a larger scale. And when we are in denial of our humanity, guess what? We break.
And I think what's also important, interesting to talk about, potentially, I believe, and that's again my very personal experience or belief, we can deny certain things for months, we can deny certain things, probably even for a lifetime, but this denial will eventually land on the plate of our children or our partners or our environments. And this is where it spins back to this intergenerational, intercultural trauma, right? So if we stick to stay this strong person because we have achieved this and that, or because we don't want to change something, it will eventually go somewhere else. It's not going to be eradicated. It's going to go somewhere else. And this is, yeah, as you said, like one of the reasons why you do what you do, why I do what I do, and why we do what we do, is to educate people, that you don't always have to be strong. You don't always have to stay strong. And even if you have been strong for the last 5 or 50 years, there's always a time to acknowledge something. And as you said, you can continue potentially with what you have been doing for the past 20 years, 10 years, 50 years, because this is your area of expertise, but doing so from a different heart or with a different intention will change your, again, individual reality and perception of such. And I believe this is this really, really important acknowledgement that we can make, is acknowledge and accept. And this is the first step. And from there, healing can and potentially will happen if you just allow it.
Yeah. And one point that you made beautifully, and to tie it all up, is the recognition, the fundamental recognition of future generations, the fundamental recognition of the humanity of our children and their needs. And that's important. And I know that parents love their children. That's why they bring them into this world. But inadvertently or unconsciously, they end up harming them. Gabor said, trauma is not only what happens to you, it's also the essence of what should have happened for you that didn't. So if you have a workaholic father who compensates for the disordered family life, the dysfunctional family life, by working even more, so he runs away from the family, makes money, is never home, buys kids everything that they want, but isn't present, can subconsciously inform the kids that they're not wanted, can make the children feel abandoned. He may bring in his own rage towards his wife or partner, or she may bring rage towards her partner, which throws the family off balance. The children respond differently. The children respond with rage. And that's not even including the stimuli of social media and the pressures of trying to belong to a certain group, to be accepted, and all of these completely and utterly fucked up things that children have to deal with these days. So they're constantly under this pressure to be other than self, and then the parents make them feel like they can't be themselves or feel accepted by them because they're not even there. They're dysregulated, and then creates a more dysregulated person. And these dysregulated people grow up to do more dysregulated, distorted things, and so forth and so on. And that's why we have intergenerational trauma.
No, and absolutely. And thank you very much for that very explicit remark. And another theme that came to my mind is it also goes both ways, right? So if I understand my father was or was not an alcoholic or a workaholic, I can also appreciate that he probably did not do because he's just a bad person, but because he himself, or she herself, if it was my mother, got this trauma, got those traits from somebody else. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but can it also be that Payam, because he's the first one to acknowledge those challenges and those difficulties, is actually healing trauma that's multiple generational? I don't know if that is the right word.
Multi-generational trauma, yeah. The trauma of our ancestors, right? So yeah, beautiful question again. I don't think of time in a linear fashion. Time is circular and time collapses on itself. And I've experienced that in medicine and in spirit world. And now physicists are actually talking about time collapsing onto itself and building up. So while our parents or our ancestors may not have been here, in our healing ourselves, we're not only healing the present moment, but we're healing the ancestors and the future generations simultaneously. And what's beautiful is, and I've seen this happen through and through, is this peacemaking with our parents and with their parents, while we recognize their fundamental humanity and their fundamental flaws and that they didn't know. And so we don't carry those burdens anymore. We carry less of those burdens, or the less weight of those burdens, because we realize their fundamental flaws in humanity. And they didn't have the tools that we do, luckily. They were just trying to get by and survive. We cannot fault them for who they were, because they were just operating. They were just trying to feed us and do the best that they could. They just weren't resourced and equipped and mentored and given the tools and the keys from within to make the shifts that they needed to make, that may not have wounded us in the way they did. But wounding, in my view, not that we should be wounded, not that we should all deserve to be wounded, can be a great catalyst for shifts and change and healing and the becoming of the whole, and recognizing our fundamental humanity and the fundamental power that we possess from within, and the power that we have to catalyze change, not only within internally, but also externally, and be the guiding light for others and be the example that others can follow.
No, I really like this catalyst for change, and what we've just explained for different generations in one family may also be true for hardworking businessmen and women in a society. So your boss or your colleague or the company that you work for, certain people may do what they do because they learned this is the right system. This is what we have to do. And we either say, okay, this is the way it is, and we're not going to change anything. One approach, if that's your way to go, good enough, I suppose. But I really like this notion of, regardless of when you are listening to that, and if you're opening to do something about it, you can be this catalyst for change for yourself, for your family, for your team, for your society, for really a big, big impact. So if you're listening to that and you say, okay, that kind of makes sense, and you start listening to yourself a little bit more, and maybe you do some work, you can be that catalyst if you choose to. And I think this is something that all of us can also understand. We can either say, okay, somebody else will fix each and everything and this is not going to happen. Or we understand in the end, the action is always with ourselves, especially when we talk about this personal, individual perception of truth, right? We are all our own catalysts for change. And if we are just sufficient catalysts for change and change makers, well, then we will make that change on a societal scale.
Yeah. And I invite people to be open to that, to recognize their fundamental humanity. And that requires courage. That really requires a lot of courage, because men, by and large, or people in the business sector, are forced to abide by certain rules and measure up to certain standards, which essentially, as we recognize, deprive them of their own humanity. So it's a disillusion of a particular matrix or framework or paradigm, and the reconstruction of another that requires a certain population of people. It needs this critical mass for us to say, hey, people actually performed just as well when they were living at home and the kids were around, and we could reconfigure the way we work in the corporate world. And maybe they need to turn up to the office 2 days out of the weekend, and they can be with their families. That in and of itself is a recognition of our own humanity, because when we were living in villages, guess what? We didn't have offices to go to. And if the kid cried, we picked them up. Or if the kid of our neighbor cried, we picked them up. So COVID was a really interesting thing. As much as I wish it catalyzed more changes than it did, it has forced some of us to re-examine ourselves, corporations to re-examine themselves, and shift things to where things can accommodate our fundamental humanity, yet actually benefit the output and the performance, and maybe even increase that because people are just happier.
Wonderful. Payam, thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation. I really did enjoy that. And as I said earlier, I have 3 questions that I ask each and every of my podcast guests. And the first one would be, what motivated or influenced you over the past week?
It was witnessing the unburdening and the healing of others. That gives me life. That propels me to move on in the face of all difficulty. That's why I do what I do.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I want to acknowledge you for what you're doing, Payam. It's wonderful. And it's great that you share your skills and your expertise with the world. That as a side note, not a little side note, but a side note. And the second question would be, whom are your mentors, or whom do you look up to?
Yeah. Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, who's no longer here. Gabor Mate is one of the guys that really informed and influenced the way I think, as he continues on doing so. Dr. Richard Schwartz of IFS, Peter Levine of Somatic Experiencing, Pat Ogden and Janina Fisher of sensomotor psychotherapy were amazing in their field. And every person that I work with.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Payam. And that leads me to my last and final question for today. And that is a rather hypothetical one. And I call it the 3 truths. or the 3 facts. And I would like you to imagine you're traveling in space all by yourself, and you in fact do so for quite some time. Could be a couple of months, could be even a couple of years. And after all that solo travel, you encounter a human-like species, and they can only process 3 facts about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know us. What do you tell them?
Don't put me under pressure, why don't you? Good God. 3 facts about humanity, 3 truths. Oh man. That there is love, and love is all healing. There's pain and darkness, and without darkness there could be no love. Without love there could be no darkness and pain. And above that, and encapsulating that, is the oneness of all.
Beautiful. That's, what we've talked about, right? Love, darkness, and balance, and the oneness of all. And with that, Payam, thank you so much for that very enjoyable conversation from my end. And if you have any last and final words for our audience today, it's all yours. And thank you so much for being a guest on the Just Another Mindset podcast.
Find me if you want. You know where to find me. I'll be delighted to speak to you. Thank you again for everything.
If you enjoyed this podcast and learned from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or two, and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating, and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ishmaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Be yourself positive. Just another mindset.